So welcome everybody to the Creating a Home in Schools, Sustaining Identities for Black, Indigenous, and Teachers of Color webinar. We're just so excited that you're here with us today and so excited to celebrate the book launch for Longoria, Dr. A. Longoria and Dr. Francisco Rios for their book and this contribution and the innumerable conversations that will start throughout the country and the world in terms of thinking about teacher education and thinking about work with BITOC teachers in schools. So thank you for being here, and it's just great to be here this afternoon. I'm Kevin Roxas. I'm a professor at Western Washington University and the chair of the Secondary Education Department, and so grateful that Francisco and Longoria, we all work together. So this is a great opportunity for me to be engaged. And then the other panelists you see on the screen, which is also incredibly exciting, many of them are recent alumni from the secondary ed program at Western Washington University where we work. And one person, Nathaniel, is a current student. So that's who we are. I'm gonna say a couple of housekeeping things just to make sure I've covered those things. We'll be recording the first part of the webinar, which is going to be mostly a presentation by Longoria and Francisco on the book itself. Then we're going to have a discussion, an informal collaborative discussion with our recent alumni about the book, about their experiences. We hope to have it a coffee shop style conversation, informal. And during that part, we will stop the recording. And at the very end, we're going to come back to Q&A from the audience. So that part will restart recording. So first part and the last part will be recorded, and I just want to announce that here. For people who need it as well, this seminar will be closed captioned. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option if you would like to click on that and have the closed caption. The schedule for today, I briefly mentioned it just a few minutes ago, but I'll have some opening remarks. We'll do some brief introductions of the recent alumni from our program, and then hand it over to Francisco and Longoria to do a presentation on the book talk, and then we'll have a discussant panel, and then we'll go back to the Q&A at the very end, and we'll end at 5:15. This is a webinar format, so we know many people have used Zoom, but we've structured today's book launch and discussion about the book as a Zoom webinar. While you'll notice you won't be on the screen, there will be several opportunities for attendees to ask questions of today's presenters. One way to do that would be to use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Another way to participate would be if you have a question, go to the Q&A button at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. That's where it appears on mine, and ask your question there. Both the chat and the Q&A will be we'll be watching that and kind of bringing that back into discussion within ourselves here. So without any, actually one of the things that I'd like to do, and hopefully people can do this, is using the chat function. If you'd like to, those people who are participating today in the audience, if you could drop your name in the chat if you'd like to, how you're connecting to the seminar. Maybe you heard about it through Teachers College Press, maybe you're a student at Western, maybe you're a colleague of one of our panelists here. We'd like to know who's here and build community connections for a short time together. So I'll start there and add my own. And go ahead and just kind of introduce yourselves as we start the session. Without any further ado, let me introduce our student alums who are currently teachers, and one person is in our program currently. Karanbir Deol is a teacher in Mount Vernon schools. Karanbir finished the program in an alternative route elementary program in the Woodring College of Education. Giselle Alcántar Soto is a teacher in Everett schools and finished the MIT secondary Master's in Teachers secondary program at Woodring College of Education. Eldred Vidal Vázquez is a teacher in the Everett schools also, and also completed the MIT secondary program. Nathaniel Okamoto is currently a student in our MIT secondary program. And Angelia Thornton is a teacher in the Highline schools, a graduate of our MIT secondary program. So 4 students graduated, three graduated from the MIT secondary, one's a current student, and one graduated from the alternative route elementary program in the Woodring College of Education. At this point, I'd like to, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Francisco Rios. Francisco is a professor of secondary education at Western Washington. From 2011 to 2017, he served as the dean of the Woodring College of Education at Western Washington University, and he received his Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin, excuse me. Before coming to Western Washington, he worked at California State University, San Marcos, and the University of Wyoming. Francisco has been a leader in multicultural education for decades now, has served as a senior associate editor of Multicultural Perspectives, the journal of the National Association of Multicultural Education, program chair for Division K for the AERA annual program, and was the founding director of the University of Wyoming Social Justice Research Center. Francisco served as the president of NAME, the National Association for Multicultural Education, from 2014 to 2016. I'm excited also to introduce Dr. A. Longoria. Dr. Longoria is the assistant professor of secondary education in the Woodring College of Education. They are a strong proponent of multicultural education, identity-sustaining pedagogy, and bridging the theory between methods, practice, and foundations, the theory, in teacher education. A former high school teacher, they're a co-advisor and faculty for the Masters in Teaching program. They currently serve as co-chair for the AERA Queer Studies Interest Group. And along with Dr. Vero Velez, who also works in our department, Longoria is co-supporting the development of ethnic studies curriculum with a collective of teachers in the Bellingham Public Schools. So at this point, I'd like to introduce, hand it over to Dr. Longoria and Francisco to take us to their book talk, and we look forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. So I'm hoping that you can see our shared screen now. Francisco and I are just really thrilled to share this book, this work that, isn't it wonderful to be actually like have a little pride for something that's out in the world that we hope can inspire. So thank you everyone for coming out to support. Francisco and I would like to start with acknowledging the land that we currently occupy. We are in Bellingham, Washington, which is the traditional lands of the Lummi and Nooksack people, and also Coast Salish people that have been here since time immemorial. Rather than sort of doing compulsory or the ever popular land acknowledgements, we'd actually just like to take this opportunity to invite everyone here to think of and be mindful of what work are we doing toward true repatriation of land, and also toward honoring Indigenous sovereignty, which is also inclusive of intellectual sovereignty. And we'd ask everyone to be thinking of how are they not replicating what Tuck and Yang call settler moves to innocence. So one of the things that Francisco and I explore in the book is this idea of sustaining identities for Black, Indigenous, and teachers of color, or BITOCs, as we call them. So we wanted to first start with, so what do we mean by sustaining identities? So actually quite recently, we had our local-ish representative, and some folks here actually, this is your representative. So Representative Marilyn Strickland wore a traditional hanbok in taking the oath of office for Congress earlier this year, and Deb Haaland, in taking the oath of office for Secretary of the Interior, wore a traditional ribbon skirt. So we actually believe that these are modern day examples, contemporary examples of folks resisting, silencing their identities, invisibilizing their identities, but rather to assert them and to not let those go away. And that really is at the heart of something we hope to inspire for BITOCs. I'm going to turn it over to Francisco to talk a little bit about the purpose and vision for the book.
Yeah, thank you. You know, certainly when we think back about the amazing scholarship that's actually being done about Black, Indigenous, and teachers of color, we were really inspired, and it's really been a proliferation of work, including, I will say, a new handbook of research on teachers of color that's forthcoming from the American Educational Research Association that is being edited by Conrad Gist and Travis Bristol. So there's a lot of literature and books about BITALKs. But we were interested in trying to write a book for BITALKs. And in doing that, there was a convergence of several things that kind of led us to that. First of all, we were interacting with BITALK teacher candidates. And several of them, including one of our panelists here, were really explicit about the fact that most mainstream multicultural education texts are primarily written for white students who are mostly just coming to understand, let alone affirm diversity. And it was these BITALKs who were asking us very directly and very explicitly when there was going to be a multicultural education text that was for them, that spoke to their experiences. And in a way, it began to drive us thinking about this idea of creating a textbook that addressed that need. At the same time, we were both experiencing students of color who would come and seek us out for professional advice about everything from navigating hostile school climates to addressing microaggressions, what Kendi calls racial abuse, to how to affect change in schools or questions about how to be leaders in schools. And so because of this, we framed this book really as an extended love letter to BITALKs, as well as a textbook that would have important content around multicultural education that we felt was especially important for BITALKs to know. In short, the focus of this work is on how BITALKs might come into their work in schools, particularly around theorizing diversity in education historically and contemporarily, as well as conceptually, developing a clear understanding of the challenges that they're going to face in schools as BITALKs, and then the incredible assets that they bring when they bring their full cultural and linguistic identities into the classroom. The next slide, please. So I want to just take a quick moment to talk about the metaphor that we used, creating a home in schools. And it was really, we found it to be a pretty productive metaphor, but we also were cognizant of the very moment we were living in which many people were actually, especially as the COVID was going on, were actually losing their homes. We also recognized that what became home in the ideal as a safe space were for many people not very safe, right? We also recognized, and we honor, and we talk about in the introduction of the book as we develop, as we talk about the development of the metaphor, the fact that when we think about a home, there's all kinds of homes in all kinds of configurations and all kinds of structures. Nonetheless, we felt most people at least were familiar to some degree with the home, and it would serve as a productive organizing device for each of the chapters. So you can think about coming into, like if you were looking for a house, you would see, first of all, you'd want to ask, well, what's the community? And so in that chapter, we talk about mapping the contours of the profession. What kind of professional experiences or what kind of professional context are they going to be coming into? When they find their home, they might begin to look at the foundations of the home, right? And in that, we write about the theoretical and ideological foundations that we think are particularly important for BITALK teachers. We then think about an entryway, and we think about how you represent your first impressions and how you represent yourself as you come to the door. And so we talk about representing through multicultural and culturally centered education. We then move into a living room and where we begin to talk about sustaining identities through teaching and learning. So you think about people who are in your living room where you're starting to express who you are in a little bit more, in a much more familiar way. We then talked about the kitchen and the closet. And here's where we talked about things that are, really the most difficult things for us to talk about with respect to schooling, what teachers of color are likely to experience and how they might navigate that. We think about then the patio as a place where you can go to just re-energize yourself or to celebrate accomplishments, to celebrate important milestones, a way to re-energize yourself and to re-energize yourself in community. We then move to the rooftop, and when thinking about the rooftop, we think about visioning and action planning for sustainable futures. And we even in the appendix added a tool shed where we list some of the best organizations and web pages that are both important in terms of networks, but also important in terms of suggestions for BITALKs about how to be successful in schools. So let me give you, excuse me, let me give you an example of how we use the metaphor. And it's from chapter 7, and you'll get a sense of the metaphor and how we use it to introduce the chapter. So it says, perhaps the last place you might consider inspecting when thinking of your house or home is the rooftop. If you did, you would inspect it to see what materials it was made of: wood, ceramic, asphalt, slate, metal, but a few examples. We would want to know the quality of those materials, including how will they withstand the weather. You also will look to see whether the roof was flat or pitched. You might even consider looking to see where you would have the easiest access in case you had to clean or repair the roof. In effect, we typically imagine the roof as that part of the house that protects you and your home from the elements: wind, sun, rain, among other things. Beyond this very basic description of what you might view from the roof, we might also think what we can do from a roof. Given the appropriate roofing materials and the right pitch, the roof might be a place where you can sunbathe. It can be a place, which I've done, by the way, it can be a place to get a broader overview of the immediate area and local community. It can be a place to watch a fireworks display in a different part of town. And it can be a place to watch a meteor storm, or simply to peer into the vast deepness of the stars in the night sky. Perhaps it provides a place for contemplation. In so doing, you might even begin to imagine an infinite array of possibilities and futures yet unknown. In our minds, a powerful image of the rooftop comes from this children's book author and illustrator, Carmen Lomas Garza. Her painting titled Camas para Sueños shows two young people atop the roof of a house, pointing at and admiring the moon while contemplating their future. Inside the house, a caregiver is making up the bed. The roof and the bed are two places for dreaming. It is this image of the roof to which we now turn. We want you to imagine sitting on the roof, thinking about the longer trajectory of your career within the teaching profession. We want you to imagine yourself as part of a larger community. We want you to imagine what kind of education and schooling the future holds in store. We want you to be and remain hopeful. And we want you to be thinking about what you might plan to do to move toward those possibilities and futures. Like the physical structure and makeup of the roof, we believe that these are central to protecting you from the elements and weathering any storms you may encounter in the profession. So I hope that gives you a really good sense of how we were able to use those metaphors to tie in what we thought were really important ideas with respect to advice for teachers of color.
So we wrote this book, as Francisco said, as a love letter for BITALKs. And so we just wanted to clarify, so what do we mean by BITALKs? What are some of the conditions that BITALKs are facing? And so, as many of us do know, BITALKs leave the profession at faster rates than their white colleagues. We are in Washington State. Washington State still continues to hover between 9 and 11% teachers of color in the whole teaching force. Nationally, we're around 20%, and Washington State, frankly, has been behind the national average for as long as I've been in the state, which is almost 2 decades now. Our teacher education programs are predominantly white, both in faculty and the students that they educate. So this then begs the question, for whom are our multicultural education courses designed? We also know that we have seen the effects of COVID-19 on the working conditions of BITALKs, and not just in virtual learning environments, but in all of the extra work that is put on teachers and especially BITALKs in this time. But we want to remind everyone of an important caveat. We do not believe that BITALKs are some magical panacea for education. And BITALKs are not inherently folks who enact critical praxis by simply existing within a space. But they do bring experiences and connections to communities that are important to the livelihood and vitality of our school systems.
So we wanted to point out what some of those assets that BITALKs bring to the profession, to their students, their schools, and their communities, and to give you an opportunity to take a look at just some of the assets BITALK teachers bring. And they bring these as a result of the kinds of social and cultural experiences they have living in the United States. As Dr. Longoria mentioned, these are not innate, right? So most people just focus on that first one. And we just hope that people will begin to tell a more complete story when they mention why BITALKs are so critical in their schools. And certainly there's no question that that serving as a role model is an important function and is an important asset that teachers of color bring to the profession. But we also hope that you will begin to help us amplify the explanations about the whole variety of assets that teachers of color bring to the profession. These assets will occur when we acknowledge, honor, and support towards sustaining students' cultural and linguistic identities in the classroom. And they even help to explain why quantitative research is showing that BITALKs support and raise the academic achievement score of students of color. I want to just go back to something that Dr. Longoria mentioned. We want to be very clear. Increasing and retaining BITALKs is essential to schools, but it's not sufficient for the kind of real school reform that is so very needed.
So within our book, we offer, in order to understand why identity-sustaining pedagogies are so important, we offer a critique and perhaps a hopeful practice for teacher education. So in traditional education, we might look at this image from top down, in the sense that we train teachers to be somehow identity neutral, or even dangerously identity averse. And this is all wrapped up in these notions of Western objectivity. So in burying one's cultural identity, that is buried by the dominant cultural values, the needs of students, teacher education, training, and ongoing professional development offered in school districts and in the profession, and professional standards, to where that teacher candidate going through and leaving a teacher education program learns to bury their cultural identity, and especially the experiences of BITALKs, we theorize, in having to bury cultural identities. What might it mean, though, to read this from cultural identity outward? What might it mean for BITALKs to center their very own cultural identities and paradigms to inform how they enact professional standards, how they take up and enact their education and teacher ed programs, how they look at and serve the needs of students, and how they indeed speak back to dominant cultural values rather than feeling like they must suppress or supplant their own core cultural identity values. So we also want to acknowledge that we are playing on the same playground as what we call culturally centering education. So we have culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy by Geneva Gay and Gloria Latson-Billings, and more recently, scholarship on culturally sustaining pedagogy, Paris and Alim, and also the wonderful work being done in ethnic studies. I'll also give a little shout out to anti-oppressive education. So a little shout out, I looked in the chat. Thank you, Kevin Kumashiro and Christine Sleater, for being here. We pose identity sustaining pedagogies. And since we're like in a book launch, I figure I'll have my little book reading moment and I'll just read from the book while y'all can read from the slides here. So if you got your little text, I'm on page 94, if you wanted to follow along. But I'd like to read to you how we articulate our vision for identity-sustaining pedagogy. So we raise the point that a BITALK's cultural values can and should be central to their teaching practice. While a teacher's general training and professional expectations might downplay this centrality, we pose that cultural identity must remain intentionally foundational to a BITALK's practice. We call this identity-sustaining pedagogy, for it is an act of cultural preservation to sustain one's own cultural perspectives, values, communication methods, and ways of being in the world in enacting curriculum and instruction. We do not suggest here that identity-sustaining pedagogies are some feeble act of celebrating diversity within schooling. Rather, to enact an identity-sustaining pedagogy is to liberate both the teacher and all students from an invisibilization of the centrality of identity in instruction. We see identity-sustaining pedagogy as complementary to culturally responsive teaching and culturally sustaining pedagogy approaches. Whereas these authors have focused largely on encouraging educators to enact practices that benefit and sustain students' cultural identities, we offer that identity-sustaining pedagogy is the BITOC equivalent to nourishing and advancing their own cultural survival and education. As BITOCs enact identity-sustaining pedagogies, we believe that they will be more fully present in an unprecedented way in the enterprise of education. This presence means that BITOCs do not deny, hide, or shy away from their cultural, linguistic, political, and intersectional identities in the planning and enacting of curriculum and instruction. We also want to be clear, however, that as the reading said, this is not just some blind celebration of identity. In many ways, we advocate that this is a sustaining of identities, but the best of our identities, and that there will need to be a critical look at our cultural identities to perhaps root out those that are anti-Black, that enact racism, that enact transphobia and homophobia. So this is not just some endless celebration of what BITOCs bring, but rather something quite active. And to this end, we pose 4 core actions for identity-sustaining pedagogies. Now, most of these are a little self-evident: resisting times where identities are being silenced, actively including identity in teaching and learning. And we believe that through the process of sustaining identities, we empower other identities that are experiencing marginalization. But admittedly, in the book, we focus the most on what we hope to nourish in BITOCs, the idea that pushback will happen. That as part and parcel to sustaining our identities within this enterprise of schooling, we must normalize that pushback will happen. This pushback is not always external. This pushback sometimes needs to be from our own selves in enacting a critical praxis in education. So we didn't want to talk at you the whole time, because this is really about celebrating BITOCs. And so we are so incredibly grateful to have former students and working teachers and real BITOCs that we wanted to invite to a conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to facilitate this discussion. But I just wanted to reiterate to our brilliant panelists, we want to thank you for bringing your perspectives. We asked them to quickly read through the book to be able to speak to it. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Quickly and carefully read through them. But thanks, Longoria, and thanks, Francisco, for just that amazing work and framing of what is an important topic, but also just the way you brought it clearly to us, the needs and the ways in which we can think more about our work altogether. I would just want to say a couple of things, just kind of logistical, before we get to our panelists. Here we'll have a discussant panel conversation. Our panelists will give a short introduction to themselves and connect to the work, the presentation, or what they read, and we'll continue with other discussion questions from there. At the very end, from about 5 to 5:15, we'll field questions from the Q&A chat, down at Q&A at the bottom. So if you'd like to add your question for the panelists, please submit it there. This is a reminder to Melinda, could you kindly turn off the video recording? Jeremy, and they write, love the book, reading a chapter a night, and it fills my heart. So my question for the panelists is, what parts of the book do you think could be most useful, and I guess it'd be for Longoria and Francisco too, would be most useful for high school age BISOCs who are questioning whether to pursue teaching at all, really, or even finish high school. So, what part of the book do you think might be helpful to them? I think framing it out, zooming out a little bit more, like, what would you say? Like, because this is the real thing. BISOCs thinking about becoming teachers, or, maybe even, I don't want to finish high school at all. I'm just kind of done. So what would you share, panelists?
I'll just chime in real quick and say that I think that there's a nice overview of the history of people of color and teachers of color, very quick, brief overview that I think would be really wonderful for young people to read and encounter. Particularly, I'm thinking of Jeremy's working at a wonderful teaching academy, and I just think that that is important for a BITALK in training to see that legacy that they are inheriting as they enter the profession. And I might also just suggest, in addition to the identity sustaining pedagogy framework, I would invite them to look at the testimonios. Something that we were really proud to include in the book are some activities to make it happen, to take the themes of the chapter further. And also, we were pretty intentional with what we call Wonder Alone, Wonder Together, which is a book feature of ongoing discussion questions that we hope really scaffold really deeper thinking. So I'll just point to particularly using this book with young people. Please do use those book features.
Yeah, I'll mention another one, which is we have at the end, in one of the appendices, a kind of a series of questions, like a plan. So people can plan, starting asking themselves, why are you doing this work? So I think that would be, again, for high school students, that would be really accessible, because you could just start working through those. And then I think the chapter 4 that talks both about the assets of teachers of color, so that they can see that it's not just about having a dark face in front of a classroom, but that there's these amazing things that they can do that to affect change in schools. And it connects then to their to the identity sustaining pedagogy, because it tells them, we're inviting you to bring your full self. You don't have to hide who you are. In fact, we think that by bringing your full self, that's when all those assets that we identified really come into play. So those are the ones that I would suggest that might be good for high school audience or high school readers.
So Jeremy, your answer is the todo. It's only about 200 pages and some change just to sign the whole book. And I'm happy to come talk to your students.
Absolutely.
Another question we have from Nadine Bryce is, where might this book fit in the life of learning to teach for BITALK and non-BITALK teachers? And, I don't know, Nadine, but one thing that I'm thinking about when I see this question is, like, how could you use this book? Like, I heard our panelists say, I'm going to share, we're going to do a reading group, we're going to do in our equity, so maybe we could have a conversation about what that might look like. It could be with an equity and diversity committee at your school, or with a leadership council. I'm just making these things up, but I'm curious what you all think. And Francisco and Longoria would have some thoughts as they read in the book, but also you as practicing teachers might also have some ideas. How might this book be used with BITALK and, excuse me, non-BITALK teachers?
I just wanted to give a little shout out. Hey, Nadine, thank you so much for supporting. Nadine is part of a group that I'm with the Institute for Teachers of Color, committed to racial justice. Nadine has been a wonderful leader in getting BITALK teacher educators together and building off of some of the great work that Rita Colli and Marcos Pizarro and the ITALK team have been there. Nadine, this is a really great question because, Francisco and I frankly struggled with, we wanted this for BITALKs. It's a love letter to BITALKs. So how do we be clear to other folks that are so eager to read the book, non-BITALKs, as you put it, how should they encounter it? We want them to read it because we want this book ultimately to find its way into BITALK's hands. And I think in part of that process, we need all teacher educators to really consider this book, and what we hope is to inspire them to help support BITALKs in the profession so that they do not leave the profession. And also to make conditions better. Something we write about in the book, Nadine, is this idea, like, how do we make our teacher education programs worthy of the brilliance of BITOCs? And we hope that non-BITOCs and non-BITOC teacher educators, so teacher educators, might consider what we advocate for in the book. But we do have some text features. We have an explicit note to white readers that is in the appendix that we hope that our white readers consider. But as Angelia said, this is really for us, by us. And that's really where we wrote it. And so we just hope that everyone who's not a BITOC that encounters this book, that I hope that they come away with it understanding why this book was needed and why this book was written as a love letter to BITOCs. And then the make it happen, perhaps, is to think of, so now how in my context can I better conditions to support BITOCs? But we really hope that non-BITOCs see this as a gift to be able to get some insight. So thanks for the question. Francisco?
Yeah, I think, we also were thinking about who might be the appropriate audience. And we thought about high school teacher academies might be good. We thought about first-year students at a university, or we thought about an introduction to multicultural education course. So this could be good. But we even thought about, that teacher out there who's by themselves, who just needs, to hear some voices that really speak to them and the kinds of issues and concerns that they were. So thinking also about in-service teachers was certainly part of the group. So, we did try to have a big umbrella in the sense of who we felt would be really appropriate to read that work. And, I guess I would say this is one of those where, depending upon the context that you find yourself, you'll figure out the best way to use that text.
So thanks, Francisco and Longoria. We're entering into about the last 5 minutes of the webinar. So what I'd like to do is do a couple of things. First, I'm going to put in the chat kind of a question or feedback from the audience. We can't necessarily see you per se or call on you, but if you'd like to provide some feedback in the chat to our incredible student alumni panelists, I put their names there and you can see them there, and also our wonderful authors, that'd be great as we kind of close up. So that's one activity. I think the other activity is I'd love to have a final word, if you will, from our panelists, our alumni panelists. Maybe it's what's something that you're thinking about as we kind of wrap up here. You're something you want to share with these 55, not odd, you're not odd, but 55 or so people in the audience in thinking about this work, right? Your voice is really powerful, so I want to invite you in to, if you have something to share, that you do have something to share, but if you want to share it now, about what should we be thinking about? A lot of teacher educators in the room, a lot of practicing teachers as well. I see some administrators as well, and so your voices are important. So I'm going to kind of leave it to you for last word, and maybe I'll just randomly call on Karanbir if it's okay. And Karanbir, maybe
Kevin, just real quick, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for supporting the book and for serving as our moderator. I'd also just like to give a very special thanks to Dr. James Banks for his support of the book. I see that he's in attendance. I want to give just a special thanks for his encouragement, for the beautiful words that he wrote in the foreword, and also to congratulate him publicly for being named to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on that recent election. I'd also like to thank our dean, our interim dean, Bruce Larson, for supporting our work and for being in attendance. Our wonderful colleagues, I'd just like to give a special shout out to Jana Seka and Christina Carlson, who are our department staff and make this work possible, to Elaine Mahari, who is just a brilliant program manager for the Education and Social Justice minor. Thank you to Genevieve Carrillo for the marketing, and to Melinda Asink for the technical assistance. So just wanted to give a little shout out for thanks.
And thank you to all the panelists who did an amazing job. I wish we would have been recording it actually. In retrospect, you had beautiful words. And thanks to all the attendees as well. I mean, I know this was really important for us, but to know that it was also important for you to take time out of your day really warms both of our hearts. Yeah.
Thanks for Longoria and Francisco for doing the thanks, and for all the work that brought us here with our students, our graduates here, alumni. So I'd like to then end with just their words, like what's something that you would like to share with us? I think it'd be a fitting way to kind of wrap up our session here.
Yes, I believe I was being called on. But
You were.
thank you, Kevin. I think, I guess the words that come to my brain son agua para las raíces, right? So water for the roots. I think even in just this short conversation that we had, and I got to hear from my fellow BITALK colleagues and their interpretations of the book and what they're taking away from it, it's like centering, like as Longoria and Francisco said at the beginning of the conversation, right? Centering our culture in our pedagogy. And when the question of who is this book for, when can they use it in life, I don't know what BITALK would not like see these words of affirmation and feel a sense of rejuvenation after reading them, right? I think that refreshing feeling of like, oh, right, I matter. Like, oh, right, what I bring to the table is unique, and like no one else brings it but me and like my fellow BITALKs, right? And what we have is what will help us move forward, right? Not what will solve it, but what will definitely help. And I always want to remember, Longoria, thank you for reminding me when we first, I think one of our first meetings, you said, you know, you're not a Superman, you can't fix everything. Like, get some help. And I was like, got you, buddy. Thank you. So that's the words that come to my brain.
Could say something. Hello. Oh hey. Oh hey, yay. I'm thinking of identities. I'm thinking of how it feels nice to be affirmed in that way. That it feels a little less weird to say like my ethnic background's in a classroom, because it's, you know, that's who I am. And I remember, I will share a random Longoria story that they do not remember, is whenever I went to an advising session with them, they told me that they stopped saying that they're half and half a long time ago. And it means a lot to me. But thank you. And I want to leave it there.
I'm thinking of, in our district, we've been doing a lot of really intentional work around recruitment and retention of teachers of color, but in particular retention, right? Because we're not trying to bring in more teachers of color into our district if we're not gonna have a welcoming warm space for them. And this book to me is a tool that I feel like we can use that will have a big impact. Many of our teachers in our district consistently told us, I feel alone. And I feel like in having this book, it will not only bring us all together, but it will arm us, English is hard, arm us with tools to be able to combat that loneliness, to be able to create resistance, to be able to normalize pushback, to be able to bring our identities into a classroom, all of us in the district, right? So it's kind of, so I have this beautiful hope and I feel full of love and hope that I have a tool to make impact, and even better, have access to the wonderful authors to ask them questions and get help from them. That's what I'm thinking.
One thing that I've been thinking of this entire, oh, I'm so sorry. I keep thinking of letting go of our, like, the imposter feelings, letting go of not feeling good enough, and use this as that nourishment, to use this to like allow you to feel your power as a teacher. That's something, like, 2 years in, I'm not like I'm still early career and everything, but it's just, how do we get rid of that imposter feeling? When does it ever go away? So something that I am kind of left with even after this, this session is just let us all feel our power as Black, Indigenous educators of color. Let us feel that. Don't feel like an imposter. Don't feel like we're not meant for this space, because we are.
I think I want to say to our BITALK candidates and teachers here present today that to have some grace for yourself in doing this work, to remember that this work can be done by our lonesome, and that I hope that when you have this book, because I know you will, that you will share it and read it with another BITALK teacher. I think it has been really great to have Giselle to share it with as I'm reading it, and it's just a different experience. And I hope that you'll be able to also do that in sort of community with others, and then share it with somebody else.
So thank you again, panelists, and thank you again, Francisco and Longoria, for sharing your work. There's nothing else we can add to the brilliance of our graduates and our current MIT student, our current student in secondary ed, just their brilliance and the wisdom that they share with us about their experiences. We wish everybody who attended today a wonderful and safe rest of your day. And again, thank you for joining such an important discussion and webinar. Take good care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.